Okay, welcome everyone to our plenary session. Our keynote speaker is going to be Professor Alejandro Cuñat. Alejandro Cuñat studied his degree at University of Valencia. Indeed, with Guadalupe Serrano and I, we share five years of our degree together. So it's really a pleasure not only to introduce a great academic, but also a friend, and really a friend that we appreciate a lot. So Alejandro is currently professor in economics at the University of Vienna. When he completed his degree at the University of Valencia, he immigrated to the United States, completing his PhD at the Harvard University. He has been also lecturer at the University of Essex and the London School of Economics. At the time, I coincided with him. And he was professor, I was a student. And finally, the topic he's going to talk today is the relationship between trade barriers and trade unbalanced. We asked him to offer us kind of an overview of his most recent research on this field. And the floor is yours. It will be around 1 hour, 15 minutes. But Alejandro was telling me he's happy, I understood, that you raise your hand. And if you have any question, clarification, intervention, he's happy to address the questions as he presents. So it's really a pleasure to have you finally in our 22nd INTECO workshop. It's not the first time we invite him, and also we got him a year ago, just for be sure that this year he was with us. So thank you very much, Alejandro. And,
thank you very much, Paco, for this very generous introduction. First of all, let me thank everyone involved in the organization. This has been a great conference, and I've had lots of fun. I've seen many interesting papers, so congratulations to the organization, and I see that this is also actually quite an adventure, so I hope that you will keep it for many years. Let me, of course, thank you for having me. I mean, as Paco said, I did my first steps as an economist in this house, so it's always great to be back here. And finally, Paco already mentioned it, but I will say it anyway. There's the icing on the cake, at least for me, is that actually the two people that are most involved in this organization were the ones with whom I sat in class for many years while studying here. I hope no one is going to take this as a symptom of cronyism or anything like that. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about something that is actually quite or a concern, a set of concerns that are quite current nowadays. And this is joint work with Robert Simek. Robert is at the IMF, so since I'm going to say things that I hope will be at least thought-provoking, but some of you might controversial, let me stress that this is my and Robert's views and not the views of the IMF. And this is going to be based on three. Sorry, I think I muted my. Did I mute myself? Now I'm fine, right? Okay, sorry. This is going to be based on three pieces on which Robert and I have been working, still working in some cases, over the last few years. The two that are with a darker color, you can find them on my website. So if you Google me, you will find the papers very easily. I'm afraid that the third one is still a non-paper. That's the responsibility of the IMF management, which is keeping my co-author very busy with other stuff. But hopefully, maybe this is wishful thinking. In December or January, we will have something else on our websites. Good. So the motivation of this paper is easy, I hope. So I'm going to deal with one of these many things that we were debating about yesterday. I'm going to talk about globalization, and I'm going to talk tangentially, so to speak, about how there's a certain skepticism about globalization here and there, and what people are doing these days, and I want to analyze what the potential effects of these things are. Okay? So let me, for the sake of clarity, let me just briefly explain or set the stage for what I'm going to discuss. So In recent decades, we have seen trade imbalances have become very large. And I will try to convince you that these large imbalances, besides, are more of a permanent thing rather than a transitory thing. Okay? And they have taken center stage in the policy debate. Now, one first question, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? For example, trade deficits are regarded nowadays very negatively. Okay? And allegedly, although it's unclear or difficult to understand the rationality of certain policy moves, some people are trying to reduce, or some countries are trying to reduce these trade deficits with increases in trade barriers. Okay? Is this possible? If so, how does that happen? And if that happens, by how much? Okay, so these are, again, something that interests me. Now, the answers to some of these questions, there are answers to these questions in the economics literature, and also in the, let me call it the blog literature. Blogs, there's many economists who are writing about these things, and they tend to give us or offer us some, what I'm going to call common wisdoms. You know, a trade deficit is, if you're a trade economist thinking in static terms, is a great thing, because I'm going to be able to spend beyond actually what I earn. And therefore, we shouldn't worry about this trade deficit being a bad thing. A macroeconomist thinking in intertemporal things might have another view. Will say, no, not another view, sorry. We'll say, hey, there's gains from intertemporal trade. Therefore, a trade deficit should be, or a trade surplus should be a good thing. Okay? When we come to trade barriers, also there is lots of discussion about these things. What we do not see is actually lots of formal analysis in this regard that tries to explore the theoretical mechanisms through which trade barriers are affecting trade imbalances, that try to see the empirical validity about the claims we make, and secondly, also the quantitative relevance of these things. Okay? Now, truth be told, this has changed to some extent. If you haven't done it, I suggest that you have a look at the working paper series of the MBR in May 2025. Everyone had prepared their paper already in advance of Trump announcing their Liberation Day tariffs, and suddenly you had lots of MBR working papers giving answers to these questions. Okay? There's also the famous, or the infamous, note by the Council of Economic Advisors justifying those parentheses crazy tariffs. Why do Robert and I still want to add to, or are trying to add to this literature? Let me explain what we're doing, and then I'm going to explain why we want to do it. Okay, so our take is, first of all, a structural gravity approach. So I'm sorry to those of you who are sick of the structural gravity approach, because we have seen already some of those things, so you're going to get one more of that. Okay, which is going to give me a very tractable framework, first of all, through which offers me a lens through which look at the data. Okay? It's also going to give me a building block for a theoretical setup in which countries trade and trade barriers matter. Okay? Secondly, and this is where we are taking on this literature to some extent, we want to combine this with a dynamic foundation of intertemporal trade. Okay? So if we are going to claim that trade barriers change trade imbalances, we want to have a theory that endogenizes the determination of trade imbalances. In some of these papers, this doesn't happen. These papers that I mentioned in May 2025, or the way they model the imbalances is far from satisfactory. Okay? So this is what we want to do, and this is how you should view the kinds of things that I'm going to discuss today. Okay? Good. Questions, I insist, as Paco said, they are welcome, and interruptions are welcome. So I'm going to present a set of ideas here. I've packaged them, so to speak, in almost self-contained bits. Okay, and which means that I can time my presentation according to how much time we spend on one, and I can give up some of those, actually. So I'm not married to rushing or to the idea of rushing over all the ideas that I have to present. Many of them, you can find them in the papers that I mentioned. But let me give you the spoiler so that I can then feel no pressure for doing that. This is the kinds of ideas that I want to discuss. So first of all, bilateral imbalances, which I didn't mention so far, but have become actually something apparently very important in the policy arena, can be understood under fairly generic conditions and are explained mainly by residual asymmetries in trade barriers. Okay? Please notice that I'm being careful with language. I'm saying trade barriers, not tariffs or something like that. Okay? So notice that, for example, this stands in contrast with some, in case you follow economics blogs, this stands in contrast with some of the things we hear in the blogosphere. So when Trump at some point started complaining about bilateral imbalances, people started to say, well, if China is running an aggregate trade surplus and the US is running an aggregate trade deficit, no wonder that the US has a bilateral deficit with China. Okay? I'm going to some extent question. I'm not disputing the facts, I'm questioning the interpretation. Okay? I'll make this clear later on. First of all, I'm going to claim, I hope I will convince you, that these asymmetries have a policy-related origin. Okay, so notice that at the top, in the first bullet point, I'm calling these trade barriers or asymmetries residual. That's because trade barriers, I'm going to measure them to some extent in the same way that we measure productivity in the form of a solo residual. Third point that I want to bring, eliminating these asymmetries will reduce bilateral imbalances, but will do pretty much nothing to the aggregate imbalances. So those liberation tariffs or liberation day tariffs that the US is implementing, or perhaps not, but we don't know, we will see. They might have some effects, but certainly not on aggregate imbalances. Fourth, the link between trade barriers and imbalances is non-linear. Okay? I dare say also it's non-monotonic, but I might not have to go over this today. And if you want to reach balanced trade in the aggregate, the price you have to pay is autarky. Okay? Autarky in goods and services trade. Here is something perhaps more thought-provoking. A trade surplus reallocates resources to the traded sector. Okay, so, and now this is a conditional statement, and I want to highlight that this is speculative. If scale economies in the traded sector are way stronger than in the non-traded sector, a trade surplus is going to actually yield productivity gains. Okay, and therefore, a trade surplus can be potentially beggar thy neighbor, or if you prefer, also, a trade deficit is beggar thyself. Okay. Finally, if this were the case, we may want to think about coordination of policies in the aggregate, okay, at the international level. Good. So these are the kinds of things that I want to discuss. I don't know how far I'm going to go. How am I doing with time, Paco? Until when do I have to talk? Oof. No, don't worry, guys. I'll finish earlier than that. Okay. Good. So, if you're fine with that, let me try to go over these things. I want to touch upon 4 different ideas. I have a 5th one, also in my chamber, but that's only if you get bored and I finish too quickly and I need to entertain you for some additional time. So I want to talk first of all about aggregate and bilateral trade imbalances. This is going to be more of a, if you want, an empirical view of things. Admittedly, partly through the lens of some theory. Okay? Then I want to talk about the trade wedge asymmetries that I'm going to find here. I'm calling these wedges because I don't want to call these barriers or tariffs. Okay? What I'm going to give you is something that is more general, that could encompass more things than simply import tariffs or something like that. And here I will try to make the case that these trade wedge asymmetries have a certain policy origin. And then after doing some empirics, I want to go theoretical. Okay, I want to discuss the link between trade barriers and imbalances in different ways. Okay, and finally, I will go back to this idea that actually trade surpluses might be bigger than neighbor under certain conditions. Okay, I've tried to prepare a very non-technical discussion. If someone wants details, be warned that I have 25 slides in an appendix here that I will only show you if you insist. Okay, so but this is up to you in case some of you want some detail. So let me start by looking at aggregate imbalances. So these are net exports, value of exports minus value of imports. This is the sample of countries we have, and we've divided the data into decades. Okay, let me explain how this graph looks like. I'm referring for the moment only to the bars. Okay, so let me think of the variance of the GDP share of net exports. Okay, so variance equals second moment minus first moment squared. Let me turn this around. Okay, I'm gonna have the second moment on the left hand side, which gives me the average deviation of the GDP share of net exports from zero, from balanced trade. Okay, and I can now decompose this object into two other objects. The squared first moment, so the squared of the average GDP share of the trade balance, and the variance of that object. Okay, I do this for every single country here, and then I'm going to average with the GDP weights. Simple averages give us the same picture roughly. So the full height of the bar is giving you this object here, okay? And this is the mean GDP share of net exports squared, and this is the variance. Okay, so notice that first of all, two things to take home. First of all, trade imbalances have increased dramatically, okay, as a share of GDP. But notice that the component that matters is actually quite persistent or quite permanent, okay? I realize there's time series econometricians in the classroom. I hope you don't mind that I'm being here a bit sloppy about these things. So this is as far as I'm going to go about persistence or permanence of trade imbalances, okay? Now, if you think about casual observations, this squares quite well with what we have seen. I mean, think of the US. The US has been running permanently a trade deficit for over, I don't know, since 1980, 1985 by now, I don't remember. And China, since it has become a relevant actor in the world economy, has been running a trade surplus. Okay, Germany on average has been also running trade surpluses, for example. Okay. Good. Now, what about the black line? Let me now already go a bit theoretical. Okay. Let me define these two objects. This is the share of country N's output in its own spending. So, if you want an inverse measure of openness. Okay. And this is a bit of a strange object for the sake of the graph. This is I'm going to construct an artificial country. This artificial country is all countries except for N. Okay? And I'm going to construct exactly the same object. Okay? Now, if I look at these objects through the lens of structural gravity, I'm going to obtain the geometric square of the trade barriers, trade wedges that this country pair faces. Okay, I will be more explicit about gravity in a minute. Okay, that line over there is just a bit of a crude proxy for how trade barriers have been falling over time since then. Important, I'm not going to claim here any causality. So all I'm saying is, hey, we lived in a more globalized world nowadays, and people sometimes are putting things together, just in a justified or unjustified way. Okay, I'm not claiming that actually the decline in this object is causing these imbalances. All I'm saying is that we are seeing these things at the same time. Okay. Good. Let me now then move towards bilateral imbalances. These were the aggregate imbalances, and since the US has become the most controversial country in the policy arena regarding imbalances. Let me look at the bilateral imbalances of the US. Trade barriers might have increased in some places, but I don't think that in general we observe very large trade barriers on average. I mean, we had a tariff war between the US and China in the first Trump presidency. There has been more, perhaps, measures of, protective measures, etc. But what the data are telling me here is that this is not the case. Of course, I hope we agree that the gradient has diminished here. Okay, so we agree to some extent in that actually globalization has slowed down, at least. Okay, good. So again, these are the bilateral imbalances of the US. Let me focus first on the top right graph. This is actually the bilateral trade imbalance of the US vis-a-vis each of its possible trading partners. These are 40 countries and an aggregate that we call rest of the world, which is a 41st country. Okay? And first of all, no surprise, there's lots of variation. Okay? So first of all, also China is, from a Trumpian perspective, is a rogue country. Okay? It's running a trade deficit. The Germans are here. I think they're also a rogue country. From a Trumpian perspective, okay? But hey, the US is a rogue country, for example, vis-a-vis Ireland or Australia, okay? So there's a lot of variation here, and this is deeply not so surprising, okay? Good. Now, but what I hate about this graph is that it is mixing pears and apples. So let me try to decompose this object, trade imbalances, as you have here, okay? So notice that I'm doing something very simple. I'm just multiplying and dividing by this term here, in this numerator. Okay, what is this? This is actually a geometric average of the bilateral trade between the US and any trade partner. Okay, so this is what has been increasing dramatically during this globalization period, because we've had over the entire period declining trade barriers. Okay, and of course this is going to interact with this other term, which is what I'm going to call a proportional bilateral trade imbalance, proportional obviously to the trade volume between these two countries. So notice that for a constant term here, if this term were to increase, because we are reducing trade barriers in lockstep symmetrically, we would also have an increase in the aggregate bilateral imbalance. Okay, so in order to isolate this effect, I will focus on this term. So this term is what you have here. For example, notice that Canada and Mexico are trading a lot, second and third here, Mexico and Canada in order, second and third here, and of course they have a large volume of bilateral trade with the US, okay? But China is the first bar. It also has a large volume of trade. But notice that actually China has a much larger proportional imbalance than Canada and Mexico, sorry. So in order to avoid that this part here masks effects, I'm going to focus on this one here, okay? Good, let me now go gravity.
Out of curiosity, which were the countries that had similar trade imbalance with China?
Are you referring to these ones?
Yes.
The Swiss, Indonesia, Slovakia, Lithuania. Okay? And this is just data. I'm now going to look at data through the lens of theory, but so far this is just data. Okay? I didn't mention this, sorry. This is based on averages for the period 2010-2014 or 2011-2014. Okay? Good. So let me now bring up the idea of structural gravity. So here you have the structural gravity equation. I have here the trade flows for industry S between exporter country N prime, first subindex, and importer country N. Okay? And this is going to be, let me start from the end. Obviously, this is going to depend on size. The expenditure of the importing country, that's ESN. It's going to depend also on the size of the exporting country. Gross output of exporter country M prime in industry S. I'm normalizing here. This is not so crucial, but just for completeness, this is the world output in industry S. Okay? And what do I have here? Here I have the trade barrier or trade wedge between exporter country. And so this is the trade barrier that affects the exporter when trying to introduce goods into country N, okay, which obviously is going to be raised to a minus trade elasticity. Okay, and here we have the famous or multilateral resistance terms, which are capturing general equilibrium effects. Okay, since they are not going to play, quantitatively speaking, much of a role, allow me not to dwell onto what the multilateral resistance terms mean, etc. Okay, all I want to say is, hey, if you are very keen on these things, we are keeping track of the MRTs in our quantitative work and in our estimations. Okay, good. I think I mentioned already all these animals, so let me move on. Here you have the MRTs. Please allow me to skip them. So important result, at least from the perspective of someone who is more theory-minded than empirically minded. We can obtain this gravity equation from many, departing from many models. Okay, take Armington, take Krugman, take Ito and Kortum, take variants of Melitz. You are going to generate that equation. Okay, so I'm taking a stand. If anything, I'm taking a stand on the CES demand structure of these models. And this is key, of course, and it's restrictive. But other than that, whether trade is motivated by product variety or by comparative advantage, etc., is irrelevant. Okay? Good. Now, notice that some of this stuff in my gravity equation is data. Okay, so the D and E are data, and also the left-hand side is data. Okay, so I need to find an estimate for tau, and I need also to find estimates for the multilateral resistance terms. Okay, so what I'm going to do is simple. I'm going to simply estimate or run a regression of, obviously, how do you call that? The Poisson maximum, pseudo maximum likelihood. I'm going to run the bilateral trade flow on exporter and importer country fixed effects. And then I'm going to take the residual as tau. Well, tau to the power of minus theta s. So for the moment, I don't need to take a stand on the value of the trade elasticity. And I also get, from the fixed effects, I also can back up the MRTs. Okay, this is what I'm doing. Good, so assume that we have already done that. And now let me do the following exercise. I'm going to add across all industries. Okay, and I'm going to do that the same for the other side of this bilateral trade flow. So I'm going to take MSN prime N, and I'm going to aggregate across S. Then I'm going to take MSN N prime, and I'm going to aggregate across S, and I'm going to subtract. That's going to give me a measure of the total bilateral imbalance. I'm going to normalize by that geometric average that gives me the size of the trade flow, bilateral trade flows, and then I'm going to log linearize. Okay, this is a first order Taylor approximation. Okay, and the beauty of the first order Taylor approximation is obviously it's going to give me a linear expression that is going to help me separate the effects of different things in colors on bilateral imbalances. So let's go over that expression. I'm sorry I used colors, but I didn't know how to fit all the things I wanted to say on one slide. So this was the most practical thing. Just one thing in terms of notation. Aggregate gross output for the national accounts is simply aggregate expenditure plus the trade balance. Okay, and here I'm just normalizing objects that I've already mentioned by the corresponding country aggregates. Okay, good. So now the term in red, what is this? This is actually the idea that an imbalance between China and the US must be driven by the aggregate imbalances of China and the US. Okay. The blue term, I'm going to try to explain it in the form of triangular trade. Think of the following silly example. Imagine we have three countries, A, B, C. A exports to B and does not import from B. B exports to C and does not import from C. And C exports to A and does not import from A. And let me assume that all these trade volumes, all these trade flows are equal in size or in value. Aggregate imbalance, 0. Bilateral imbalances, different from 0. Okay? So depending on, bear with me, Benedict, for a second. Depending on the production structure and the expenditure structure of countries, we might have these things. So yesterday I was presenting something similar in another audience, and I said, hey, no, sorry, no, let me not bring there. Sorry, or let me bring it there. Imagine that actually we're talking about the industry that produces paellas. The industry that produces paellas exports a lot from Spain. Okay, so if the French like paellas, they will import a lot, and maybe we have a bilateral imbalance there. Okay, it's just a silly example to which I will come back later on. Benedict, thanks for waiting.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to clarify because otherwise I get lost. So what you took the bilateral gravity and then you write down the bilateral trade balance, divide by the two trade flows, and then you do a first order Taylor approximation around.
I'm going to show you in a minute. It's at the end of this slide. Okay, so I'm going to kill two birds with one stone by showing you the last bullet point. Okay, and it's going to be important to clarify actually what's going on here. Okay, good. So I think I was here. Okay, the third term is the key term. This is where I'm going to see lots of action, and this is what I'm going to call a bilateral asymmetry in trade wedges. Okay, the fact that actually shipping goods from the US to China is penalized more than shipping goods from China to the US. For what reasons? We might have here issues of policy-induced trade barriers. We could have also issues of preferences. Maybe the Chinese like Spanish paellas, but they don't like French paellas. This is, in this gravity setup, is isomorphic to Spanish paellas facing a lower trade barrier towards China than the French paellas. Okay? Now, obviously, mismeasurement, misspecification, all those things might be in the error term, admittedly. Okay? So, finally, we have the differences in the ratios of outward and inward multilateral resistors terms. I insist this term is going to be inactive pretty much, and this is simply capturing the general equilibrium effects that arise from differences in all these other terms. My last bullet point is also perhaps going to help us clarify things here.
Maybe it's a question with the example that is it about preferences or preferences part of the trade patterns? So say, for example, we don't buy American cars, not because they're better, we don't like it.
Well, I would call that a preference, but I mean, I'm not going to get into a battle of semantics here. So, I mean, what we are talking about is a bilateral preference. Okay, the fact that I might like American cars less than German cars. Other things equal, I'm going to import more German cars than American cars. But provided we agree about what this is, I don't care how we call it. Good, so let me consider the following. So here you have, Benedict, going back to your question, the point about which we are approximating. Zero imbalances for all countries having the same production and expenditure structures. and having symmetric trade barriers. Okay? Now, imagine that I were to actually do that to shut down all these channels. Imagine a world that is, so to speak, very symmetric. Then actually, I would get, sorry, first of all, the multilateral resistance terms cease to play any role, okay? And besides, we would have no bilateral imbalance, okay? Good. Any questions on this? I'm going to play with this now, so if there's questions of it or interpretation issues, please feel free to comment. So if not, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take each of these 4 terms, and I'm going to plot it on the vertical against the term on the left-hand side. And then I'm going to run a regression of the term of each of the terms on the term on the right-hand side. This is going to give me the share of the variance of the bilateral imbalance that is explained by the covariance between each of these terms and the term on the left. Okay. One last thing. Notice that I'm log linearizing. Sorry, not log linearizing. Or I have a first Taylor approximation here. The correlation between this aggregate and the original bilateral imbalances is very high. It's in the ballpark of 0.9. So this should be no matter for percent. So let me show you those 4 plots that I was thinking about. The dashed lines are 45-degree lines. Okay. So notice that. Let's make a long story short. This is what matters. Okay. There's very little action as well. Okay, so yes, bilateral asymmetries seem to be very important in a statistical sense to understand what's going on with the bilateral imbalances. Okay? Good. What else can I say about this? Remember, I insist these trade wedges or these asymmetries are capturing all sorts of things. Okay, so let me try to analyze what they are to some extent. Okay. So first of all, here you have actually how things look like for the US. Okay, and yes, China, Slovakia is actually even more rogue than China. Okay, so China is a rogue country. Don't ask me about Slovakia. I mean, they're neighbors from Austria, but I don't know much about the country. They are very friendly people. That's all as far as I can go. Okay. Good. So if I were to show you the same plot for Germany, Japan, etc., even China, you would also have lots of variation in these bilateral imbalances. Okay. So this is not very satisfactory as it is. So let me try to dig deeper into that. So I'm going to change now empirical strategy. Okay. So I'm going to now devise an empirical strategy that only depends on the structural gravity equation, not on how I estimate it. Okay, and this is not our invention. We are borrowing here from a paper by Lorenzo Caliendo and Fernando Parro. So let me assume that the trade barrier can be decomposed into the bilateral trade barrier can be decomposed into these 4 terms. Okay, we have first term an exporter barrier. So when country N prime exports to country S, they face some barrier, okay, which is just specific to the exporter country. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. This is the same for the importer country, okay. Now I'm going to throw in a symmetric, the bar here means symmetric, a symmetric bilateral trade barrier, distance, okay. And finally, I'm going to allow, here's an arrow or a vector, I'm going to allow for an asymmetric component of the bilateral trade barrier. Okay? Good. So if I assume gravity and I consider these triplets, the first 3 terms are going to cancel out, and I'm just going to have the taus with the vectors on top. Okay? So you can think of this as another measure of these asymmetries. Okay? Good. So obviously, the further away from 0 the measure, the larger the extent of pairwise asymmetries. And notice that once again, I'm simply using as an assumption about the form of the trade barrier and data, once again. Okay? So here's what we are going to see. I'm going to split, I have 10,000 of these, and I can only perform this exercise for goods sector. So far I've been talking about all of trade, including goods and services. But the problem I'm going to have now is that when I use service information on services trade, I'm going to have zeros. And I need not explain the audience what happens when you have zeros inside a logarithm. Okay, so so I'm going to use to do this for only for the traded sector, 15 traded sectors. Okay, and I'm going to split the graph my data into triplets in which there's 1 or 0 EU members, 2 EU members, or 3 EU members. Okay, and here you have some kernel densities for some of these sectors. Okay, red is for triplets with 3 EU members. Blue is triplets with 2 EU members, and black is 0 or 1 EU member. And notice that the densities for the red triplets and the blue triplets, in comparison with the black ones, they are shifted to 0. Okay. I have here things by sector, there's lots of numbers there. Notice that there are some numbers in bold. These are the medians, and here I have 3 EU members, 2, 1 or 0. You can see easily that actually the differences are substantial, and they are much smaller here. These numbers are much smaller than these ones, and these ones are smaller than these ones. Okay? So, in other words, it seems that there is something about policy. Okay? It seems that all the efforts of the single market pay off. Okay? All these things that Brussels tells us to do, which is to some extent equivalent to dismantling trade barriers, are occurring. Okay? If this is not good enough, here's an additional finding. If I take the asymmetries that Robert and I estimate and compare them and I take bilateral symmetries for new accession members between this period and this period, and compare them with what they were here, they have declined. Okay, so becoming an EU member country implies that your asymmetries with the EU member countries, old EU member countries, decline. Okay? So this gives us an idea that actually it seems that trade policy here is operating to some extent. Benedict, what was that, Hannah?
So the accession stuff I see more, but if I just see these graphs, EU members, like the triplets were, there is someone in the EU and someone not. And I'm putting on my macro hat, trade balance imbalance. Could it be that the EU countries, they're all old, they all have Sula structure, and so if I have a triplet where they have an African country, Middle Asian, they are not as old as we are, and so you get
you're going to have to explain me why being old on average implies having some asymmetries in the trading balance.
No, but I mean, the standard argument, right, for trading balance, like it's about savings and investment and so on.
Well, this works for aggregate imbalances. We're talking about bilateral asymmetries here. Okay?
Yeah, but I'm just adding, I'm trading with a country which is very different. I'm just trying to push you on, this is really trade costs.
I mean, this is as good as we can go with this data. There's an exercise to be done. This was being discussed yesterday at some point, which is, one thing we should do perhaps is correlate our asymmetries with asymmetries in tariffs. The problem is that this implies that we're going to have to work hard on the data because, I mean, we have here a coarse level of aggregation, and import tariffs are by the product category. So, but this could be done. But I don't have a better answer so far. Sorry. Good. So okay. So I hope I've convinced you that there's something here. Okay, and that these bilateral imbalances are partly the result of policy with all the caveats that we might have here. Okay. So what I want to do now is try to think about how to think about this in theoretical terms. Okay. So what if I were to shut down these asymmetries? What would be the effect? Okay. What if, rather than focusing on the asymmetries, I raise trade barriers? What Trump has been doing lately. What's going to happen to the trade imbalance of the US? Okay. These are the kinds of things that I'm going to think about. Of course, I need theory. I need a model. Okay. And I've been trying to find the simplest possible model to deliver here. So I'm not going to discuss this. In my appendix, I have the algebra of the model. But if you are satisfied with my English description in English of the model, I'm happy to stay there. Okay? So I'm going to have a model that has two key ingredients: intermediate inputs and trade barriers. Okay? First of all, I need the intermediate inputs and the trade barriers partly to match the data. Okay? A model that only had trade value added and was free trade wouldn't give me actually what we observe in the data in terms of trade flows between countries. Now, with trade barriers, we are going to have a home bias in consumption. Okay? And with a home bias in consumption, we are going to have the transfer effect. Do you guys remember the transfer effect? So the transfer effect goes back to the Treaty of Versailles, okay, when Keynes gets very mad at the Allies. And remember, the Treaty of Versailles imposes reparation payments from the Germans to the French, among others. Okay? And Keynes said, hey, this is a double burden on the Germans, or I prefer to call it the double whammy. The first burden is that actually you are forcing the Germans to make a transfer of their income to the French. Okay, so that's a loss in utility terms for the Germans. But secondly, if we have home bias in consumption, the French will not spend the transfer in the same way that the Germans would have done, which means that this is going to raise relative demand for the French goods and is going to actually create a deterioration of the terms of trade of the Germans. That's the double burden. Okay? So that's what we call the transfer effect or the transfer problem. And for those of you who like the history of economic thought, in the Economic Journal of the late 20s, there's a very interesting debate between Keynes and Olin about this topic. Anyway, this is gossip by now. So I'm going to have a transfer effect here, and the transfer effect is going to matter here, because this is actually the mechanism through which, at least in a neoclassical model, which is one I'm going to give you, trade barriers can affect trade imbalances. Okay? So that bullet point, I've already discussed it with you guys. Let me also highlight that if we have imported inputs, this is going to weaken the effect of the transfer effect. Why is that? Well, if you have imported inputs, even if the French spend most of their transfer on French goods, they are going to still demand German inputs if actually intermediate inputs are a large share in the cost component of the French production process, and therefore we won't have that much of a transfer effect. Okay? Notice that, by the way, that this is something that has, and we are not here that original, this has been thrown at the Trump administration. You guys don't understand what the tariff barrier on imports of intermediate parts for the American car making industry is going to do. Okay, this has been said. They were warned. Okay, good. So let me go back to the dynamic side of the model. I need here, or ideally, I want to have, or I prefer to have, a model in which trade imbalances are permanent. Okay, this goes back to the first picture I showed you. Permanent here, I'm going to understand it as steady state. Okay, so I need a model that gives me imbalances in steady state. Ramsey is not a good option. Okay, in Ramsey, if I have for example, different rates of time preference, this of course can create trade imbalances, but we're not going to have a steady state. Okay, I could have the idea that a country suffered a shock in the past, and since then they are rolling over their debt and they're just paying interest rate. I don't find this a very credible or fruitful view of the imbalance. So I want to have a model in which actually countries, given their differences in characteristics, run trade imbalances permanently. Okay, and this can be obtained if we actually kill people, or at least allow people to die, or if we actually, perhaps more rigorously, if we allow people to be born. Okay, so what matters is new coming cohorts into the economy. Okay, and this suggests either an overlapping generations model, the typical 2-generation overlapping model, or if you want to go more sophisticated, a Yari or Blanchard-Yari model. This is what we use in some of the papers that I mentioned, But in the third paper I mentioned today, we went simpler and we are using a very run-of-the-mill overlapping generations model. Okay, so to that model we are simply going to add an internationally traded risk response. Okay, so there's no complete asset markets. There's risk here, there's uncertainty if there are shocks, which I'm not going to consider in general. But and what we are going to have is really intertemporal trade. Okay. Good. So why do we have a motive for intertemporal trade? Maybe people in some country are more impatient than others, than in other countries, or maybe we have different lifetime income profiles, which is what I have in my appendix here. Imagine that there are countries in which, in the first period of your life, you get a larger share of your lifetime income than in the second, and there are countries that are on the other side of this comparison. Then obviously, those that have a larger share of their income front-loaded, they want to save, they want to lend, and the guys that have their income back-loaded towards their second period, they want to borrow. Okay, and this is going to give me a motive for trade, for trading assets. Okay, so this is the kind of argument we have, and one can show that in this case you have actually in steady state, which is what I'm going to worry about, is you have actually trading balance. Okay, good, and obviously non-zero net foreign asset positions. Okay, so this is the model. So let me run a couple of counterfactuals here. Let me still stick to the issue of these bilateral imbalances. Okay, and let me consider now a world in which I shut down the asymmetries. I'm going to forget that I don't know what those trade wages are. Perhaps they are policy, perhaps they are not. I'm going to assume that all of them are driven by policy, and I'm going to assume that I'm going to consider a scenario in which I equalize for each country pair the trading balances. Okay? Sorry, the trade barriers. Okay? And this is what's going to happen in the model to the proportional imbalances. This is data. Okay? And this is the counterfactual production proportional imbalances. Okay? And as you can see, yes, shutting down those asymmetries kill to a large extent the bilateral imbalances. But I'm not showing you that. You're going to have to take my word. The aggregate imbalance remains pretty much the same. Okay, I will discuss this in a minute. Okay, let me just show you another counterfactual, and then I will try to provide the corresponding intuition. So here you have financial autarky. Financial autarky understood as simply that I'm going to force countries to have zero net exports. Okay, I'm still allowing, in principle, for a country to export to a country and not import from that country. But I'm forcing here zero aggregate trade for each country. Okay, and you have here that actually bilateral imbalances change little. Okay. Obviously, the macro imbalances vanish because this is what we are doing. This is the counterfactual. Okay. So what we have here is actually something that is quite counterintuitive with respect to what some of the people have been discussing once again in the blogosphere. Okay. So yes, the bilateral imbalances, you can kill them with the symmetry. Okay. And yes, you don't kill them with the aggregate when you kill the aggregate imbalances. Okay. Good. So what's going on here? Let me go back to the theories. I mean, why would countries have different financial positions? If they might have different financial positions, it must be that there is discrepancies in different directions in a model, for example, in which there's no capital in income minus consumption, or if there's capital, saving minus investment. For some countries are saving above what they invest. Some countries are investing more than what they save. Or some people, if there's no capital, some countries are consuming more than they earn in terms of aggregate income, and some other countries are doing the opposite. Now, in aggregate terms, or in a macro model, the key variable here is the interest rate. Okay, the interest rate at which those assets are being traded. So, if any of these has implications on aggregate imbalances, it's because it must change the interest rate. Okay? let's try to see what's going on here. So let me go to the case of symmetric wages. Okay, so for symmetry in the wages to affect aggregate imbalances, it must be the case that they affect the interest rate, as I was saying. But actually, this effect is going to be very small. This would only operate through general equilibrium effects. Okay, and it's unclear the direction in which these general equilibrium effects are, given that the imbalances, the asymmetries can have different directions for different country pairs. Okay, now why do the imbalances affect? The symmetry affect the imbalances a lot, or the bilateral imbalances? Well, you know, if I change tau, I'm changing relative prices. I'm changing relative prices directly, and this is going to have a first order effect. Okay, so if now trading with, say that the symmetry implies that now the Chinese reduce the trade barriers against the US. Now, from a Chinese perspective, it is cheaper to consume to buy US goods. Okay, and this can actually generate first order effects as far as the bilateral imbalances are concerned. But there's no first order effects as far as the interest rate is concerned, therefore no effects on the aggregate imbalance. Now, so basically what we're going to have is a reshuffling of the bilateral imbalances. Okay, maybe say that symmetry between we run this symmetry, and then this implies that the bilateral imbalance between the US and China is going to be reduced. But for the same aggregate imbalance of the US, this implies that you know, this has to pop up somewhere else with some other country pair. Okay? Now, a move to financial autarky is going to lead, obviously, to TN0. This is going to generate changes in relative prices, the transfer effect, but these are, again, general equilibrium effects, because these are second round effects. Okay? And this is going to have a very small effect on, obviously, it has no effect on the trade barriers. This is going to have small effects on the relative prices. It's not going to change bilateral imbalances by much. Okay, so chances are, I mean, the Americans have threatened even to go autarkic or to throw sand in the gears of the financial markets in order to reduce their negative net exports. Chances are that this will reduce the negative net exports, but this will not change their bilateral imbalances. Good. Different exercise now. Imagine that what I do now is, let me forget about asymmetries, and imagine that now I simulate a trade war in the following sense. First of all, I'm moving to a two-country example. Okay, so imagine that I raise the average trade barrier for the two pairs, for the two countries in a pair. Okay, so one would be free trade, and as I go to the left, I'm moving towards a more autarkic regime. Okay, we're inventing some numbers here. So we are creating a world in which, under free trade, the two countries have the same GDP. Okay, these are two equally large countries. Okay, and what I'm going to do, I'm assuming that home is running a trade deficit, okay, and foreign is running obviously a trade surplus, okay. And what I'm going to do now is simply move from left to right, okay. In case you need some reference number, say that this is the US and China, okay. US home domestic spending share in GDP is in the ballpark of slightly below 0.9, okay. So we would be departing from this situation, roughly, somewhere here, somewhere there. Okay. So what's going to happen here? What we are going to see is, obviously, as trade barriers increase, notice that transfer effect is going to kick in. Okay. The Chinese relative GDP is going to shrink because they are the countries running into the trade surplus, and that they are going to take the double whammy that I was mentioning before. Okay. So you can see this here. But please focus for the moment on the blue line. Okay, obviously, gains from trade are going to start shrinking. Home real GDP is going to decline. Okay, what is this? Home terms of trade are going to improve. but notice how they are improving. Notice that the slope at regional levels of trade barriers is very, very, very small, which means that the trade deficit of the US is going to change very, very, very little. Okay? So if you want to really notice the scale, if you want to really go actually zero trade deficit for the US, you're gonna have to go here. Autarky, almost. There's never autarky in this model. We are using an Arlington model, which means that you always want to consume a little bit of the other country's output, but it's going to be a very, very minimal amount. Okay. So what's going on here? What is the economics of what's going on here? Let me discuss it. So suppose there's only two countries, as I said, and home is the deficit economy. An increase in trade barriers raises the home buyers in consumption. Okay, so the transfer effect kicks in. Okay, that's going to raise the relative size of home's GDP. Okay, now think of the interest rate. The interest rate, I'm being sloppy here. You can think of it in a world in which you can trade assets freely as being some kind of GDP weighted average of the autarky interest rates of these two countries. Autarky meaning no asset trade. Okay, so if I make with the transfer effect by raising trade barriers the relative GDP size of the US larger, I'm going to make the interest rate in the world move closer to the autarky interest rate of the US. And then, of course, the US has less of an incentive to borrow. Okay? It's almost like a comparative advantage argument. Okay. Now, once again, at the current levels of openness, this effect is very, very, has little bite. Small home buyers in consumption, given the current level of trade barriers we have, or small in the sense that it doesn't generate much of a transfer effect. And secondly, that's the red line. If we have intermediate inputs, the red line, the effects are even more muted. Okay. Good. Paco, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So one canal, I'm going to skip this. Don't get worried. I'm not going to drag you through this. I could write a model. We've done that. A model with transitory imbalances. Imagine a world. This is the typical way that one teaches quite often the theory of intertemporal trade. Imagine a world in which we have shocks, productivity shocks, whatever you want, and countries therefore may have an incentive to smooth consumption through the trade balance, because they want to save for the future, because they know that the current shock will disappear, etc. In this model, again, through some related mechanism, the transfer effect is going to tell us, is going to operate, but it's going to be too small to generate actually any significant action. So, bottom line, of course, we've seen that the Americans have raised trade barriers, or not. I don't remember where we are at nowadays. But it's crazy to believe that this is going to change trade imbalances, at least through this route. I mean, if at the same time that they are raising trade barriers, they are passing a beautiful bill and they are raising their budget deficits a lot, maybe the problem is that they are going to reduce their trade deficits through a depreciation or a financial crisis. Who knows? Okay, but that's another mechanism which is not here. I have nothing to say about that. Okay. Good. So let me talk quickly about aggregate imbalances and welfare. So let me add the second effect of trade imbalances. So far, I've had the terms of trade effect or the transfer effect. Let me add a productivity effect. Okay. So let me go first to this one. So in the terms of trade effect, I'm reviewing something very quickly that we've already said. A trade deficit favors the country that runs it. Okay, through the terms of trade effect, that's going to increase that country's income. Okay, a trade deficit in the case of scale economies that are strongly concentrated in the traded industry is bad news, because you are going to through the deficit you are going to reallocate resources towards the non-traded sector, and you are going to reduce production in the traded sector, which means your productivity is going to decline. Unless the non-traded sector has the same degree of scale economies of the traded sector, if you reallocate resources towards the non-traded sector, your productivity and your income declines through this channel. Okay, so we have here two forces operating. Okay. Now, can you write a model? Can one write a model in which actually the traded sector is subject to scale economies? You name it. Okay. Once again, canonical models in the constant returns to scale models, you have to add either an external Marshallian externality, or you can add a learning by doing externality of the sort that people use in endogenous or semi-endogenous growth, and you can generate that. But they come perhaps up more naturally in the models with product variety. Okay. So what are we going to do here? So we write this model and we assume parameter values. There's one key parameter values, and this is why I'm highlighting that the results are speculative. We have good estimates for the scale parameter, the scale increasing returns or the external scale economies for the manufacturing sector. That's good, and these numbers are relatively large. What we don't have is numbers for services, either traded or non-traded. This is why this is speculative. So take these results with a pinch of salt if you want, and we are trying to improve on that, but we're not there yet. So here you have the result of two counterfactuals plotted against one another. The one that we are measuring on the horizontal side is a very uncontroversial one. This is the gains from trade. Okay, and we are doing here the typical sufficient statistic based thing based on the Arcolakis, Costino, Rodriguez-Clare work. Okay, and what you have here is what happens to the income of a country that runs at the current trading balances that they run. Okay, so countries that run a trade surplus are above the dashed line. China is here. Okay, countries that run a trade deficit is here. We are doing this, truth be told, for a relatively sizable scale elasticity. Okay, so this is a case in which we are loading things in favor of scale economies in the traded sector. Okay. Now imagine that this is the world we live in. Notice, first of all, message to take home is that the order of magnitude is similar of the two effects. So what's going on here? The trading balances are redistributing gains from trade, from the deficit economies to the surplus economies. Okay? Now, of course, this is in a sense a steady state or a static argument. This is saying nothing about welfare. Okay? If we want to talk about welfare, we want to also take into account that countries are trading assets and they are smoothing more or less consumption, for example. Okay? So let me do that. So imagine now an exercise in which, I don't know, every country decides to go to financial autonomy. Okay? 0 would be no change in utility or welfare. Okay, so this is a particular, this is just for theorists. This is the indirect utility function. And the indirect utility function is steady state output, which is the same as I obtained in a static model. Okay, and these are the gains from consumption smoothing that come from intertemporal trade. So actually it's pretty nice, because since it's multiplicative, we can actually write this model. We've written a model in a modular way, where we can strictly separate the effects on income and the effects from asset trade or utility. Okay. So notice actually what's going on here. So obviously, for countries that import a lot or export a lot, net exports, financial autarky is horrible. Okay, these countries would lose a lot from financial autarky. Okay, but imagine that you are running a small trade deficit. If you shut down the US, if you shut down asset trade, you are going to move to balance trade. Yes, you are going to forego the gains, the utility gains from intertemporal, from consumption smoothing, but you are going to gain productivity. So for small deficits, and these are large countries that actually drive the world interest rate, if they have a deficit, actually they might generate a gain. Okay. So if this were the world we live in, actually, we should be perhaps much more worried about international macro coordination. Okay. Last slide, I'll finish. Now, obviously, there's an inefficiency here. I mean, notice that I'm creating autarky, and some countries are gaining. This must be, we are in away from first best. Okay, which implies actually that, and obviously the lack of first best is due to the scale economies. Okay, so obviously there must be a first best policy, which is a wage subsidy for traded sector firms. Okay, that would solve the problem. Now the problem is that implementing this first best policy is tricky, because you need non-distortionary taxation to finance it. You need knowledge of the scale elasticity, which we are having trouble with ourselves, and you need actually all N to cooperate and implement the same policy. Otherwise, you're going to have relative price distortions in the international goods markets, goods and services markets. And besides, this might be incompatible with international agreements. Okay? Good. So I insist the strength of this mechanism is uncertain. This is very speculative, but it's a word of caution. I mean, we take for granted certain results that are actually sometimes easy to overturn. I didn't mention much in this regard, but I mean, we are not the first ones to suggest that a trade surplus can generate productivity gains. I mean, there's a very cute paper by Krugman in the Journal of Development Economics in 1987, has Mrs. Thatcher in the title, which does the same. Or a recent paper by Gianluca Benigno, Luca Fornaro, Martin Wolf in the AR are also, in a sense, speculating about these kinds of things. Great, thank you very much. This is all I wanted to say. Thanks for the attention.
Well, then the thing we tend to do is, then.
Lupe.
I'll speak up. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for a very interesting presentation. I have one question. The gravity model in general doesn't perform very well in intertemporal. I have one question. So the gravity model in general doesn't work very well in the intertemporal dimension. In the past, there was quite some criticism on the model, like it's a cross-country, cross-sectional model. All the theoretical underpinnings are formulated not with this intertemporal dimension. Of course, the shock, or let's say the trade policy changes that you're introducing are by nature very intertemporal. So I'm just wondering to what extent might that be a problem from a very theoretical perspective?
I'm not certain I understand what the problem is with the gravity equation from an intertemporal point of view. I didn't quite understand what you said. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, if you look at the Krugman model, Eaton, Corton, Mellett's model, they're all basically based on differences between countries at a particular moment. So it's not the dynamics in the countries that are explaining the bilateral trade flows ultimately. Obviously, if you introduce policy measures which are varying over time, and that's the source basically of what's going to happen, there might be a question like, do we still have sufficient theoretical underpinnings for what's happening?
I mean, obviously, if you change parameter values, trade barriers, productivity, etc., across countries, the trade model underlying the gravity equation I'm giving you is going to give me another prediction about bilateral inflows. So this is going to happen. Okay. Yeah. So. Either way, notice that I've tried to frame things from the start in thinking about long-run issues. Okay, so I always think when I write a static trade model or I teach a static trade model to my students, I'm thinking, hey, I'm telling them, hey, this is a long-run situation. Okay, I think of this as a long-run situation. And notice that the intertemporal dimension I've exploited mostly is the steady state equilibrium. So. I think that this is, in that sense, perfectly compatible from a theoretical point of view. I would be much more worried about what's going on, even if I've done it. I hinted that it's hiding in the slides with what's going on at the high frequencies. Then I would be more concerned about this issue.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Well, I think we are running out of time. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much, Alejandro, for your representation. And something from. Sorry? Yeah, that's what I was saying. Traditionally, what we do is when we finish the presentation, is we go home, and together with our presenter, we have a last picture. Okay? So everyone, welcome.